Hi everyone, welcome to today's live Q&A with special guest Shannan Lea, who I'll introduce in a minute. So very special welcome to everyone here, especially if you're watching the replay, and let's jump into it. So welcome Shannan. Some of you may know Shannan from our monthly webinars. Shannan and I have been working together for several years now. 2019, was it Shannan? 2018, something like that. Shannan and I run the Autism from the Inside membership community, which many of you may already be a part of, which includes monthly webinars on various topics, community catch-ups, which Shannan has been running 2 of them a month recently since the start of this year, which is really exciting. And we've got a couple of webinars coming up, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to jump on a live Q&A together. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and we'll do our best today. Oh, and also after this event, approximately an hour from now, we'll be jumping on GatherTown. If you are an Autism from the Inside member or a Patreon supporter, you'll already have the link to that. So make sure you jump on for a little slightly more personal catch up after that. Otherwise, I feel like I should stop talking. Welcome everyone who's said hello in the chat so far. And yeah, great to have you joining us today, Shannan.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to join you on your live stream. Oh, look at all the comments. Hello, welcome.
I'll just have a quick look at the comments and see if I can find one that we can bring up as a question. Sometimes I have to put a question on screen so that I can actually read it properly. Should we @ you in the comments or just use the word question? That's actually really helpful. Thanks for that suggestion, Eleanor. So if you put question, then it actually comes up in the comments, and it's slightly easier for us to see the question. So the next webinar that we're doing is on info dumping and oversharing. And so my first question to Shannan is, how do you relate as an oversharer or an info dumper? Like what's, because not all of us are, but what's your personal take on that?
I think it took a little while to focus on what I was sharing and how I was sharing, and my navigational point for that was, is it my story? If it's my story as the author or the narrator, I can share it. But if it's someone else's story, then it's their right to choose that narrative. So that was my kind of focal point that helped me do that. But I think even when I am the author, I do have a tendency to overshare, particularly if it's something that's new or really weighing on my mind. Then the relief you get from sharing that is very high. And I also find that when I articulate things, they tend to form more clearly in my mind. So how I feel about them, what my perspective is, what the context is, and all of those sorts of things help me to orientate. So yes, I probably am a little bit of an oversharer. I know my son would definitely say I'm an oversharer.
Yeah, you've just reminded me that there are a couple of different sort of points to oversharing. The one that you started talking about is like the privacy kind of, is it appropriate to share this thing? And then the second point is more, am I just giving way too many details in this that are actually not necessarily relevant. And I think I definitely relate to that as well. Sometimes I don't know what the important details are, so I just give you all of the details. And
Yes.
part of that is that I haven't processed it properly. And I see this a lot in my coaching work, where it sometimes takes a long time to say the whole thing before you realize which 10% was the actually important part that probably didn't, and we probably didn't need the rest if I didn't need the help actually processing it.
I think it's really hard to focus on the key points, because that's another level of organization. So sometimes I think it's a matter of just wanting to get it all out while you can. And that's not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it, but it does kind of help.
Yeah, that's why one of my favorite sayings is the best thing you can give an autistic person is time. Because what if I don't know what I want to say in advance, and you're actually helping me in that communication process? So
yeah, definitely.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions that I see in the chat already. Very, very quickly, number one, how do I join the membership? It's online, autismfromtheinside.com.au, and there's you'll see the membership there. It's also known as a resource vault or resource library. So that's because the membership includes access to previous webinars as well as free tickets to our monthly webinars. Okay, next question. So thanks for that question, Sharon. Next question. Do you have a partner or married? How have you managed relationships in the past? So how have you managed relationships in the past? Me personally, mixed success. In some ways, I'm quite naturally okay at one-on-one relationships. It's mostly the group stuff that I've really struggled with. But even the one-on-one relationships, I've learned a lot recently, because my tendency was to try and do everything myself. And if you try and do everything yourself, that doesn't really set you up for a good intimate partner style relationship. So I could speak a little bit more about that potentially. But Shannan, what are your thoughts on that?
I've learned a lot, I guess, like you. So I am divorced, but I currently have a partner. And I think the key takeaways I came away with was one, sphere of responsibility. So what I'm responsible for and what I'm not responsible for. And to take Brene Brown's quote, it's best to assume the other person is doing their best. And then if you do that, you're able to advocate for yourself, put boundaries in place, all of those sorts of things, where you're not reliant on the other person to provide something, or you're not externalizing that for that need to be met. You're taking that control yourself. I think the last thing in relationships was communication. So now in my relationship, we have like a monthly relationship meeting where we kind of sit down and talk about, what are our goals and how are we tracking, and how are things going. And it would never have occurred to me to approach it in that kind of business model. But when both of you are neurodivergent, it's a really good way of making sure that you do tackle the more complicated questions on a regular basis, and that you also set a time aside to do so. And the good thing about that is that you can think about it well and truly in advance, because you know when it's coming up, and you can know what you want to have on the agenda. So you've kind of got it all sorted mentally before you kind of sit down together and chat. So they're my takeaways.
Yeah, a big one that often comes up, especially in my coaching stuff, is the latency of processing time, especially with emotional things. So, like you were saying about knowing there's a meeting coming up with my partner, I can process things in advance so that I actually know what I want to say.
Yeah.
And I guess this is, for me personally, this has just been part of my larger emotional intelligence journey in terms of figuring out what it is that I actually need to say, what it is that I actually need to ask of my partner, because I spent so much of my life feeling like I had to do everything myself that it was a really big shock to learn how to try and actually rely on someone, because my very, very first popular video was called "Rejection is the Story of My Life," because that's kind of how it felt for the first 30 years or so, at least. But a big part of that was because I didn't know how to ask for help. And then when I eventually did ask for help or did try and lean on someone, well, I'd never asked them before. I'd never lent on them before. And they were just so shocked and surprised that I was asking this huge thing when I'd never even asked for a small thing, that they weren't able to give it to me. So yeah, anyway, relationships is a very, very, very big topic. But anyway, hopefully that goes some way to answer that question.
There was a comment in the chat, and that is that often people who are neurodivergent sort of suggest breaking up, and then they come back together. And I think that is because the connections have a very strong anxiety underlay. And so what that is, that's self-preservation. That's my interpretation anyway. If you offer to break up, then it's avoiding rejection. But it's also putting a full stop in something, especially if you're having difficulty coping with it. And then that's why I guess the suggestion is to come back. And I think the takeaway from that is to say it's okay to have disagreements, and it's okay to need time to work on things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a full stop to the relationship. It just means that you've got things that you're working on, or things that you might need more time for, and that it's not a rejection. It's just something that you need to work through together. And if you want to move forward, what would you need to have to make that look good? And what kind of time frame are you looking at? So again, just identifying your goals and making them realistic and timely and visible, because you can't have your needs met if there's confusion about what they actually are. So yeah, it's got to be visible.
And that goes back to an even more basic strategy of taking a break. Like there's so many situations in life where taking a break is really helpful. And sometimes in relationships, that can be really helpful as well. Just having a little bit more space than usual. My favorite analogy for this is of dancing with someone, and like the desire is I want to dance close to you. I want to get really close to you. And, for this, it's an intimate relationship, right? We want to be really close, but the closer we get, the more likely we are to step on each other's toes if we're not in sync. So if we're not in sync, the first thing we need to do is just like separate just a little bit so that I'm not stepping on your toes anymore. And then without the constant bombardment of someone constantly stepping on my toes, I can relax and think about what I actually want, and then we can work on getting closer again. But maybe we just got too close too quickly, and we didn't have the skills to be in sync as much as we needed to. Fantastic question. Let's move on to another one. We have a super chat from Eleanor, the Howler Werewolf Queen. I'm aware that you have a video on what not to say to an autistic person, but do you have a video on what would be good things to say to autistic people to encourage us? So I'm interpreting that question. What are some good things that we can say to autistic people to encourage them that we often need to hear? Any thoughts on that one, Shannan?
I think one of the things that I often say to my son when he's particularly anxious and he's making new friends is that I accept you just as you are, which is perfect to me. You know, it's I accept all of you, and it's a safe space. And let me know as well. I've tried to really encourage him to let me know how he's tracking. Now that's a little bit different from saying how are you feeling or what are you up to. But how you're tracking is how many spoons have you got question, or how you're coping with the day, or all of those sorts of things. So how are you tracking seems to kind of tack into how he's coping and relating at any particular time. So that's just something that I try and do, because if I know what his spoon count is, or what his capacity is, I can adapt accordingly.
Yeah, so mine would be similar. Probably, in my experience, it's masking and self-acceptance and self-confidence seem to be like at the core of what most people find the most challenging. And it's the challenge of being accepted by the rest of the world. And that when that's a challenge, it's hard to have good self-esteem when people around me are telling me that I should be different. So the message there that I find encouraging is people who know me like me, and the people who don't know me properly are the ones who don't accept me, don't love me, who are asking me to be different. So in terms of an encouraging message, it's something like, yes, a lot of people may not understand you, but the people that do understand you really value and appreciate you. So don't change for the other people. Like, focus on the people who already appreciate you for who you are. And I think that's one of the core messages that we need in terms of just that really basic self-confidence.
Yeah, definitely.
I saw another question. Here we go. From Emerald Queen. If you know what your needs are and you are trying to articulate them, but others are just not getting them, what should you do? I personally think this one is really common. And the word that comes to mind first is acceptance. So if that's really the situation and people are not getting it, and I've already tried everything I know how to try and they're not getting it, then, well, the first thing is to accept that they're not going to get it. Okay. Then what? Well, what do I do now, given that they're not going to get it? And this is very important from a coaching perspective. A big part of my role as a coach is to make sure that the strategy we try is different to the strategies that we've previously tried. So accepting that fact means I'm not going to try and explain again. And I'm going to catch myself every time I go down the path of my previous strategy of just trying to explain myself to others all the time. And then I can find a solution that doesn't involve the other person understanding. It might look like setting some boundaries for myself that I have the power to set, and that's it. I don't need to talk to anyone else about it. Or it might involve talking to them in a different way, that doesn't involve them understanding the specific need. I'll try and think of an example of that if I can, but Shannan, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's really tying into the don't put your locus of control outside of yourself, and require other people or other situations to fulfill your needs. I think the first thing with needs is I make sure that they're really practical. So I try and make them quite objective. I take a lot of the emotional language away from it, and it might be as simple as I need 15 minutes from 8:30 to 8:45 to myself. So if putting them in really, really practical terms is your best way to hedge your bets that someone will be able to work with that. But if it doesn't, again, take that assumption that the other person is doing their best, and what can you do? So whether that's putting the boundaries in place, whether that's taking the time, just putting yourself first and not trying to do everything else and be everything else for everyone else. And understand that those who are closest to you and love you will adapt and work with you.
Yeah, so that's a good example of finding a boundary that you can put up that doesn't require people to understand. So something like, please don't message me after hours. Now, I could go into all of the executive function things of why I find that really stressful and why I need my downtime and why it has to be so black and white for me and all of that stuff. But even if someone doesn't understand the why behind it, I can just say the very specific thing, please don't message me after hours. It's really stressful. And if they keep messaging me, I'm thinking like a boss that is just not respecting the work, not work divide, I can turn my phone off. I can like take steps to enforce what is kind of like a reasonable boundary with that kind of stuff. All right, thanks for that question. Let's share some more comments. So thanks for your comment, Pam. And who else can I spotlight? I happen to be a very slow reader, which does not always serve me well in this type of situation.
We've actually got a great question about being a late diagnosed autistic woman.
Oh, yeah.
In the same boat. Lovely to meet you. Was diagnosed just over 12 months ago myself. Being alone more, about not wanting to have to mask or actually not wanting to be around people. I think it's a combination of things. I think once you receive a diagnosis or realize that autism is you, then there's a lot more self-compassion about doing what you need to support yourself. And I think that it's an acknowledgement as well that you don't have to mask all the time. And you don't, because what you're doing is adapting your expectations. And previously your expectations were to try and fit into a neurotypical world. Whereas now you acknowledge your autistic self and you're more embracing and self-compassionate about it. And I think as we get older as well, sometimes you like a much more sort of balanced emotional interaction and self-time and social time and balancing all of those different elements, I think. So I think it's a combination of factors, but I do think it's a great thing.
It's a really good question, though. It comes to mind for me, trial and error. It's like, well, what do I like? What do I not like? What happens if everything I try is bad? Well, that kind of throws a spanner in the trial and error approach. So instead, I need a slightly more nuanced approach. Okay, that didn't work. That wasn't a fun experience. Was there any aspect of that was good and was fun that I would like to keep? So I'm thinking of examples of like over the holiday season, for example. I want to go visit my family. I would like XYZ, but it's overwhelming, but it never works out, etc. There's all these barriers. And so this question is a good example of, maybe I do want social time. Maybe I do want to be engaged, but if there are barriers, then it's going to be a lot easier to be alone. And the question is like, do I actually want to be alone? Or what is good about being alone that I really appreciate and is not replaceable when I'm with other people? Or is it that actually I would like to solve these barriers so that I can go to the party on my own terms and connect with people on my own terms and actually have a positive experience that is good for other people as well, without all those negative things. So yeah, really good question. My initial response would be it's probably a bit of both in my experience. But yeah, really good question.
I think also as we get a little bit older, we tend to ask ourselves what we want to do a little bit more. I think when we're younger, it's about what should I do, or what do I need to do, or how am I fitting in? And I think as we get a little bit older, we say, hang on, let's check some of these buckets and see if they're full, and what is it that I want to do. And that's a good perspective to come from.
Okay, question from Nathan. I'm not sure if I have autism, but most of the time when I speak to someone, I feel a big blank in my brain. That's definitely relatable. Like if I wasn't able to think and answer properly. I prefer, so is it a trait of autism? I prefer to ask a slightly different question. How common is this trait in the autistic population, and how common is this trait in the non-autistic population? And in my experience, it happens to everyone some of the time, but it happens to some of us a lot of the time. So if this type of thing is happening to you a lot of the time and it's a complete blank, then that sounds more like an autistic experience. I know for me, memories and speaking, my analogy is like a barrel of monkeys. Like they just need to, like, so long as it keeps grabbing the next one, it's fine. But then if there's a break in it, then, well, I don't know how to keep going because I was supposed to grab the next one and it didn't work. And now I've got no monkeys left.
I find also it's from a personal perspective, it's a bit of an ADHD trait where I like to think of it as like an old school pinball arcade machine where the thoughts are kind of firing off all the different barriers at different paces and different speed, but they're not necessarily connecting. So when someone asks a question, what I'm trying to do is get all of those different pinging thoughts into an alignment. And that can kind of be frustrating. But sometimes it's also a sign of a very, very active brain, that you've got a lot processing and a lot going on. And so trying to distill it down to a particular thought or answer to a question. And I think also it's difficult because sometimes questions come at you out of the blue, or they're not necessarily, going in a particular direction from a conversation. So it can kind of leave you, to use Paul's dancing analogy, wrong-footed. Mm-hmm. So that can be a contributing factor as well.
People often underestimate the interior life of an autistic person. So that's actually one of the common things, is just having a really very rich thinking space. And that might be your imagination, it might be your train of thought. And if my train of thought is going in this direction, I can't just stop the train in a split second and make it going in a different direction. That's why I really love the train analogy, just because it has that momentum behind it. And so I remember a friend of mine saying he was getting lunch at the university cafeteria, and his PhD supervisor, said hello, like in the line, and he's like, what, like, not just. I just was not expecting to see you or talk to you at the moment, and so my brain doesn't have any of the resources it needs to do that. It's like I've left home and I've got everything I think I need for today in my backpack, and then suddenly something completely different happens and I wasn't prepared for that. I don't have it readily accessible.
There's a great question here, Paul, about how would you describe autism in a really concise way? So my description, because I've had a similar experience, and I had to explain to my oldest friend who started school with me, I said, I'm autistic. And she said, no, you're not. I said, well, actually, diagnostically, the report came back with an affirmative assessment. And I said, I process things differently and experience the world differently. They're the two things. And I said, if you're a PC, I'm a Mac. We do the same functions. We are both human. But one is more visually based and direct command orientated, and the other one uses code. So that's kind of how I approached it.
So there are a handful of analogies, just like that computer one. Some people say my brain is wired differently. I would personally try and find an analogy that's the other person would understand. So the brain is wired differently fits me very well. Like my brain understands that pretty well. Another one is I'm imagining kind of like all of these dials, and they're all dialed in, some up, some down. And my dials are just a little bit further off the normal than most others. So I've got some of them are really high, some of them are really low. Some of my skills are much more attuned and some are much less attuned. And so it's just a different configuration of the same thing. It's like this is the human spectrum, and if you're statistically away from the middle enough, then that has secondary problems. And now I'm probably getting way too technical. I'm going to like start explaining tipping points and things like that. But like imagine you have like a block and then you push it. At some point, it's going to just rewrite itself. But if you go over the tipping point, the whole thing's going to fall over. So that's one of the ways I explain that. Yeah, but aren't we all a little bit on the spectrum? We're all on a neurodiversity spectrum, I suppose, technically, but being statistically on the autism spectrum means being enough away from the mean that it qualitatively affects your life in certain ways that are due to these tipping points. So that's probably probably the opposite of a concise answer. Maybe we should do
oversharing it all, Paul.
Maybe we should do a webinar on info dumping and oversharing in about 2 weeks. Maybe on the 26th of March. Would that be good? Let's lock it in, actually. Just quickly on that, in case we need an even longer concise answer, I often don't even try and explain autism at all, and just focus on what do I actually want this person to know. And maybe what I want them to know is shopping centers are too loud and too noisy, and so I don't like them. So that's why I do my shopping online. Or that's why I haven't visited a large shopping center like in several years, right? And I prefer sort of more local stuff. Or maybe I need them to understand, please don't send me a text message after work hours. And whether they understand autism or not, it's more about the specific request or the specific thing that I need that person to understand. And keeping the monkeys coming from my brain, circling back to the needs conversation before, something I was going to say is a helpful framework for me has been 3-part nonviolent communication. Shannan sort of mentioned it a little bit briefly, where instead of getting upset about something, you say very explicitly and relatively unemotionally what you need. So the 3 parts are what you need, like this, when this happens, I feel like this because this. So it's like, when you send me a text message after work hours, I get really stressed because I can't relax, or something like that. And it's not saying you've done something wrong. It's not saying you're a terrible person. It's not, it's just trying to explain the need and the situation as clearly as possible. So Shannan, you're really good at finding questions in the chat.
Just the chat is so prolific. It's amazing.
Thank you for everyone making the chat so prolific and sharing your thoughts. It's really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. There was one comment that I saw about focusing on responding practically and missing out on the emotional nuances and, I guess, content. And I thought that was a really interesting one, because sometimes it's particularly difficult to tune into those nuances. But I also think it's important to explain amongst your closer circle of contacts that sometimes with autism, the emotion and the language or expression don't necessarily match. And I describe it often as sort of being a duck. I can look relatively calm on the outside, but underneath, those little feet are paddling really, really, really fast. And that maybe living with autism is a little bit like being a duck, but you're not allowed to swim. So you're not allowed to be in your comfort environment and your environment that supports all of your strengths. But I know that often miscommunication happens, and mis-emotional alignment as well. So, for example, my son has a really fast turnaround of, once he releases that stress or that frustration, he is 100% okay. And it's within a few seconds. And I emotionally can't keep up with that, to just let go of what was all that friction and frustration in a conversation. And sometimes it's okay to say, look, sometimes I just need a few minutes. Give me a few minutes to kind of process that. I can't turn around quite so quickly, or I can't emotionally process quite so quickly. And I think, again, it's just putting that into practical terms that someone else can relate to, and saying, I'm not still investing in an argument. I'm not holding on to emotions for longer than is practical. I just need to sort them out a little bit. Give me a little bit of time.
Yeah, and that's especially important with children as well. Like, using that kind of language helps them to recognize how they work as well. It's like, so you just went from 100 to 0 in about 0.4 of a second, which is fantastic. It's nice that you can do that. It takes me a couple of minutes. It takes a lot of people a couple of minutes. You're actually really, really fast at this, a lot faster than most people. So it's hard to believe, and it's hard to get your head around. And so just naming it and recognizing that it is so different to others in a really non-judgmental way can be helpful with that communication process.
And also, it's that having that point of reference, especially if they're a teenager, they mightn't realize that they're particularly good at something, or that they do something differently because they just don't have that point of comparison. They don't have that life experience, and it's a little bit hard. So yeah, it's important to kind of say, you did that really fast, great for you, but I'm lagging a little bit behind, and I might need your help.
So this question is a little bit similar to what we were talking about before around the verbal processing stuff. Like, just because I know what I want to say doesn't mean I necessarily have the words to say it. And I didn't realize how much effort I put into learning English until I tried to learn a second language. And then it turns out speaking is hard, especially speaking if I don't have anything to say. And I saw friends pick up the spoken aspect of languages really quickly. And I think it was a lot of the time, it was because they just blurted out all these not nonsensical, but non-important things, just small talk, like everyday statements about things. And I just don't have the energy or momentum to say something if I don't have something to say. So in that sense, it does take me personally a lot of effort to put thoughts into words, and the only reason I can do it is because I've had a lot of practice. But I definitely do see others with a similar barrier, and it depends on the specific thing, the specific topic, and how much practice they've had as well, and how many spoons you've got in terms of executive function. Some days I words, and some days I don't words very much. Next question, Shannon, or would you like to respond to that one?
I don't mind.
Let's try this one.
I was a little bit distracted. I know the chat just keeps on happening, and I get distracted reading. I'm sorry, that's my ADHD. Very high emotional intelligence, but I struggle to perceive how people perceive what I say or do. Like, I don't know how they'll interpret. Is this like social anxiety or autism? I think that the first thing I would say to that is that communication in general is a very, very complex process. So it requires communicating ideas and thoughts in a way that will be understood, which also needs to take into account shared frames of reference, differences, as well as the environmental and sensory factors that impact communication. So it's very difficult to understand how you're being perceived by others unless it's a direct feedback. So someone bursts into laughter, or something else that is very much guiding their interpretation of what you've done or said. So it's a very complex process. And I think that sometimes my radar in how I'm being perceived is a little skewed, because obviously there are certain biases that I have and certain things that I feel that I understand and know about myself. And that certainly is a lens that filters my perception. So I think there are a lot of compounding factors, and I don't know that that's uniquely an autistic thing. I think, as Paul said, is it common amongst the autistic community though? Yes, understanding how you're being perceived. Again, because it's a particularly complex process and there's so many factors that are working in with that. Or you can, how would you recommend moving forward if you want to perceive others more clearly, or have a better understanding of how you're being perceived?
Yeah, this is a really good example of being good at one thing and being not, horribly incompetent at something that is actually really similar. So recognizing my own emotions, recognizing emotions in others, all that kind of stuff that builds up emotional intelligence. Normally, if you can do that, which is that incredibly complex task, it comes with that you can also predict how people are going to perceive you in a situation. So that type of disconnect is a typical thing that we see in a spiky autism profile, and ultimately, it's one of the reasons that it's difficult to do that when you're autistic. Is sorry, getting distracted. Is because the further away I am from the person I'm talking to, the more my brain has to adjust to empathize and put myself in their point of view and think, how would I react? How would someone react in this hypothetical model that I'm running in my brain right now? Whereas if I'm talking to someone that is very similar to me, from the same language and the same culture and the same experiences and the same kind of general reactions, it's a lot less of a stretch. And so I can very easily do that with some people. And then in other situations, especially if I haven't had practice, then it's a purely intellectual exercise of saying, okay, hypothetically, if I were all of these completely different things to me, how do I think I would respond? And that's an almost impossible exercise to get right. The only way that people get that right is through experience, saying, well, the last time I talked to a 10-year-old about quantum physics, this is the response they gave me. So maybe, and sort of building up a bank of experience to draw from there. And we can't completely discount social anxiety, because anxiety and the fear response in general makes it more difficult to pick up on cues of other people, because we're sort of primed to look for threats in the environment, and it's not a very calm, stable, non-judgmental place to accurately pick up the cues of other people. So when you combine that into the mix, it makes it even more difficult. But it does sound like a very typical autistic trait, which is, I don't understand why people are so different from me, and it's hard to relate to them.
I think if you are finding yourself often worrying about how you're being perceived, it's okay to want to take control of the narrative a little bit. So, if I caught up with friends recently and I said, hi guys, it's fantastic to see you, but I've just finished a really big project and I'm a little bit vague, but hi, it's great to see you. That way that if I react in a particular way, they're not going to take that personally and they'll understand where it's coming from. So I think don't be too concerned about, taking some of the control of the narrative so that people know where you're coming from. And I find that if you set the ground rules like that, they tend to be a lot more compassionate and inclusive if you do that.
And that goes back to a different emotional intelligence skill, which is self-awareness. If I am unaware of what my face looks like, or what my body language looks like, or what my tone of voice sounds like, or how my language is going to be perceived and things like that, then it's hard to control the narrative, because I don't know what narrative is being generated. So with that self-awareness of knowing, most people tend to like it when you look them in the eye. Okay, so if I'm really tired and I've got my eyes shut and I'm talking to someone, I need to preemptively know that they're going to probably think I'm not paying attention, and I need to control the narrative, as Shannan was saying, so that they know I'm just tired, I'm actually listening, I do care about this conversation, etc., so that they're not getting mixed messages.
Mm.
Oops. This is one of my favorite things. EQ is as important as IQ. Well, it depends what you're doing, but if you're working with people, which is like the entire world is interconnected with people, then yeah, EQ is very important. Oops, this is another really common strategy. People like who struggle with eye contact sometimes look people in the mouth. It's also a common strategy for people with any kind of auditory or hearing processing or challenge, because if I look you in the mouth, then I've suddenly got a visual cue of what you're saying, not only an audio cue. And I found it really interesting that a lot of people didn't realize how much they relied on that until we had face masks in COVID. And then suddenly you've got no visual cue of what I'm saying. And suddenly it's a lot more difficult to hear what people are saying. So, yeah. Okay, how are we going? We're probably going to have about another 10 minutes. So we can have maybe one or two more questions. And then we will transition to our Gather Town space. So if you are part of the Autism from the Inside membership community on their website or the Patreon community via Patreon, you'll already have the link to that. So we'll be heading to that at the end of this live stream. Shannan and I are also running an info dumping and oversharing webinar coming up in, I think, about 2 weeks, or a bit less than 2 weeks. And we also have a couple of social events. Shannan's running a community chat on Monday or Sunday if you're in the US. I think it's Sunday afternoon if you're in the US. And we've also got a tea time social coming up on World Autism Awareness Day on the 2nd of April. So make sure you check out the website for all of those events and more. And let's have one or two questions more before we move to that Gather Town social space.
There's a great one here, Paul, about do autistic people take longer to learn new skills? So did you want to have a chat about the learning curve, the autistic learning curve?
I definitely relate to this. I feel like learning any new skill takes a long time. I can't just quickly pick up this and quickly pick up this and quickly pick up this completely different skill set. It's a bit different if I've already got a really solid baseline, right? So if I've learned the piano for 8 years and someone gives me a new piece of music, I can probably pick it up fairly quickly because all of my existing training is relevant for that thing. But if it's something completely different, I personally feel like there's a very large investment in the beginning, and then things get easier and easier and easier and easier. But it's like there's a huge investment. And to me, that kind of explains special interests. Because if I'm good at one thing, it's because I've spent a lot of time developing proficiency in that area. And so it's really nice to reap the benefits of that. And I don't really want to start again in something completely new. So I have one dish that I cook for dinner every night and I'm pretty good at it. Do I want to learn a second one? Oh, I don't know. That's a lot of work.
I found one of the things that made me more aware of my son's learning was when he said it just needs to be put in a way that registers with me, and so that there are different ways of learning and there are different strengths and challenges with learning, and it's making it make sense. And I think we've talked about in the past understanding the why you need to know the information, or why does it relate to something else. And I think just putting it in that scaffolding, putting it in that foundation can really help you access that information, and also relate it to different contexts as well. So it's can be a challenge. My learning style is I'm a little bit slower at the beginning, but then afterwards I take it on board, and then I tend to approach it in a really in-depth way, and that can be a little bit isolating at both ends. Isolating because I felt a little bit left behind in the beginning, and then isolating at the end because I've taken it to a degree that no one else has gone to yet, but I'm really excited about it. So it's definitely neurodevelopmental conditions have a different learning pattern. It certainly doesn't mean you can't learn. It means tapping into ways that make learning easy for you.
And leveraging what I was saying before about if I've learned one thing already, I can relatively easily learn something that's quite related to that. If I'm learning something completely new and I find a way to link it to something I already know or that I'm already good at, then suddenly I've done half the work already. So that's another common strategy when learning new things. Just link it to something you already know.
I will definitely give Miss Kitty cuddles. Miss Kitty is a Sphinx, and she decides that when I am online, that is her time to sit on my shoulder. She is very lovely, and I am very grateful for her.
Who else has pets? Shout out if you have a pet, especially a cat, in the comments.
I have 3 cats, so if we have mandatory cat showings, it could be very entertaining. Cooking is really interesting. I love it. Some of the comments are cooking, so potential sensory stress there. But for my son, it was a scientific approach, and it was a chemical approach, and that worked really well because it was breaking down measurements and it was putting things together in a certain environment, and there were so many steps and processes and controls that it was a very, very predictable process. But again, it was taking that particular approach to cooking that got him interested. If you just say, jump in the kitchen and make what you like, nothing was more terrifying. But if we have a specific recipe, it really, really worked. Oh, kitty cat love. I like pets.
Yeah, I every once in a while think I should really get into cooking. Like that would be a really handy, healthy mental health and physical health kind of skill to have. Like imagine if I could zone out by getting some chores done, like cooking a really healthy meal that I like to eat. That would be amazing. But I personally haven't got into that. Let me just quickly do a quick shout out to Darren. Thanks for the super chat, and also to Matt, super sticker. Thanks for that, Matt. That's one of the things that we can do in live streams. And what's the other thing? The weekly video premieres. So it makes it a little bit fun. All right. I am thinking, given how long it took me to form that last sentence coherently, I'm thinking maybe we should wrap up pretty soon. So thanks to everyone who has made this a fun interactive event in the chats, asking questions and super chats and chatting with each other and all of that. for patrons and AFTI members, let's jump on GatherTown now. You should already have the link for that. And so yeah, so let's wrap up there. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you at another live at some point in the future. Oh, and for all the details of all the events that we mentioned before, you can see the events section of the Autism from the Inside online website. That's right, online website, not the other website.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. And I hope to see a few new faces at our community chats where we just jump on in a safe and inclusive space and talk about all things autistic.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.